Good afternoon. No, it's afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone. So before I introduce our speaker for today, I do want to talk about next month's brown bag. Next month's brown bag is Battle for the Ballot, Cleveland Suffragist Movement. That'll be by Mary Manning from the Western Reserve Historical Society, and that'll be March 15th at noon. Should be a fun program. I don't know if any of you remember, we had a couple exhibits for women's suffrage in Erie County. And this one will talk a little bit more about the battle over in Cleveland. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker for today, David Meyers, author, historian. I'll talk a little bit more about some of his books. Now, I am going to dim the lights a little bit so we can see it better. There have been some interesting things with our lighting system in this room. So the lights could either turn all the way back up to where they are now, or they could just turn off. I blame the ghost of Andrew Carnegie personally, but just to give you a heads up that that's something that could happen, but don't worry if it does.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is David Meyers, as Jeremy indicated. This is the third time, I believe, that I've been here. I can think of 3 times anyway. I'm from Columbus, and so it's a couple-hour drive for me to come up here. But I always enjoy it because you have a lake and we don't. But there's a lot of history too in Sandusky, and I'm a real history buff, and so I always look forward to coming back and seeing what I didn't notice last time I was here. COVID's been an interesting time for an author like myself, in that I'm fairly prolific. I retired like 3 years ago, but even before that, I was turning out 1 or 2 books a year. And so that pace has actually accelerated since then. So since this book came out, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio, my daughter and I also released A Murder in Amish, Ohio, The Martyrdom of Paul Koblenz. And then our latest book, which just came out earlier this year, is The Reverse Underground Railroad in Ohio. And so that's actually the one the publisher wants us to be pushing at this time. But there's kind of a backlog in doing presentations because of COVID. Things were going along swimmingly with this book when it first came out. And I had done a couple of presentations and a couple of book signings, had a whole bunch of book signings scheduled, other presentations. COVID hit, and I get a call from the publicist that said, it's all canceled. And so nothing happened for a good part of a year after that. And then gradually we started doing the Zoom casts, which is entirely for books. And this is kind of my resume now here. This is all the stuff we have published. You can go on www.explodingstove.com and see and read about it. Also, if you do Twitter and that kind of stuff, at Exploding Stove is what we use there. And this dapper gentleman here is Albert McKnight. And he was Piqua's unofficial ambassador for years. Just kind of an all-around character, beloved of the community. And he would lead parades and all that kind of thing. So he always had his costume on. But he was descended from slaves. He was the son of a slave. And they had a large presence in the Piqua community. And so I like that picture just to show that the adjustment that they made, and they were able to find a place within that society. For many years, it was the promised land. And what we're talking about is Ohio. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Ohio had more African American settlements than any other state. They were formed by free blacks, the formerly enslaved, and runaways. At one time, Ohio may have had as many as 100 settlements. However, they had nearly all vanished or lost their ethnic character by 1900, which is the reason why so few people seem to know anything about this phase of Ohio's history and why it's interested me since I was a kid. My mother grew up near one of these settlements, the one in Mercer County, Carthagena, and she used to tell me stories about it when I was a kid. And from that point on, if I ran across anything about Carthagena, I just kind of filed it away because it was kind of this, place out of mythology. Because if you go to Carthagena, there's very little there. There's a crossroads community, a few houses, and a fairly large cemetery. And that's all that exists. But once it was probably the largest African American community in the country prior to the Civil War. And that's the kind of thing as a historian that really appeals to me, is finding those kind of stories and ferreting out the information and seeing what we can come up with. And working with my daughter, who I've done about a dozen books or so with, we just started digging into available information and also asking a lot of questions. And so we were able to come up with information on a little over 40 communities in Ohio, 40 of the 100 or so that they speculate existed. And so that's what the book's about. And, as you can see, I'm not African American. I wanted to make that clear to you particularly. As far as, I've done the whole DNA thing, so I think it's pretty certain. Fairly straight line from Germany to the United States. But that doesn't mean that's not part of my history too, because, I have relatives that fought in the Civil War. I mean, we're tied to that as well. And, Black history is American history. And it's probably how we dealt with race is probably one of the defining issues in American history. And it's not just a black and white thing. It's with how we dealt with the indigenous Americans here, the Native Americans, and how we dealt with each new ethnic wave that came in. If you saw me when I was here talking about the Black Hand, that was pretty much about the Italians and how we dealt with the Italians. So every new wave of immigration has created some repercussions. And there's been, how we've handled them has been similar but different each time. So they all kind of tie together. And so I like to, this is a way kind of gauging any progress that we've made. 1803 is when Ohio became a state. And it was the first state carved out of the Northwest Territory, which is indicated there on this map, which is a map of the United States in 1803. And I don't know how many people are really cognizant of the fact this is what the United States looked at back then. It looked like. And you can see we've got the pink states up there, including Ohio. That's pretty much what we look at as saying the North, the free states, and everything below that, the green, was the slave states. But it's not completely true. Ohio was, being the first state created out of the Northwest Territory, was free from its inception. That was written into the Northwest Ordinance, it's written into the Ohio Constitution. But all the 13 colonies all had slavery to some extent or another. And by 1803, most of them had done away with it. But even, our neighbor to the east there, Pennsylvania, they still had slavery. They had started in 1780, they had passed an ordinance for the gradual abolition of slavery. But that only applied to those who were newly born into slavery. And it set a limit to how long they could remain slaves. Those that were already slaves were still slaves. It didn't free them. And so you still had slaves in Pennsylvania up till about 1840 or so. In Ohio, the situation was somewhat different because you could bring slaves into the state. So slave owners who were traveling through Ohio would bring their entourage with them, and they could take them into the state and take them out again. Just by stepping foot in Ohio didn't make you automatically free, at least not at that point in our history. And also, you had a funny thing going on. Slave owners in Kentucky, especially, would send their slaves over into Ohio to do some work for them, or maybe to conduct some kind of business for them. And they give them a pass, and they cross the Ohio River and go into Cincinnati. And it was kind of like running errands. And that was perfectly legitimate under the law. They were still slaves. The slave owner hadn't given them hadn't given them their freedom. So they were slaves walking around in Cincinnati and other southern areas of the state conducting business. Then you also had some slave owners who would rent them out. And so they would rent them out to do work in Ohio. And then the ones that were really bending the law, in fact, violating it, were the ones who owned land on both sides of the Ohio River. And some of them would bring their slaves over and work in the southern part of the state. If they were caught, they were in trouble. But it was so sparsely populated that they didn't get caught very often. Nevertheless, even before Ohio became a state in 1803, a lot of free blacks and fugitives from slavery were making their way into Ohio. And there, at the time, Ohio was born, there was about 350 or so African. They weren't called African Americans because they weren't citizens, but people of African ancestry in Ohio at the time. You probably all heard about this, but the one drop rule. This is this insidious doctrine that if you had one drop of African blood, that made you a black person. And the abolitionists made hay of this, the people who were opposed to slavery, because they would find people like Isaac and Rosa, who were slaves from New Orleans. And they were able to, I think they purchased their freedom and then took them around to the north as kind of this walking example of what was meant by the one drop rule. Because Isaac and Rosa were both slaves. They were both considered black. You can see their complexions are a little bit different. But both were considered slaves under the law, or considered black under the law, and could be enslaved. Most people probably don't realize that the house slaves tended to have lighter skin than field slaves and were more likely to be emancipated. Reason for that? Probably because some white person fathered them. Not necessarily the owner, although that was the case in a lot of instances, but sometimes it was a friend of the owner or a relative of the owner. But because they were lighter complected, they would tend to keep them in the house, keep those slaves closer to them. And if the darker they were, more likely you were to find them out in the fields. Many residents of Ohio's black settlements were multiracial but classified as black under the law. Not only had they, not only may they have some white ancestry, but they also, some of them had Indian ancestry, because a lot of Ohio at that time still had Native Americans residing within it, and especially the fugitive African Americans, but also those who were free, found that convenient place to live is among the Native Americans because they were accepting of them. And I mentioned that some of these lighter skinned slaves were fathered by their white owners. And I didn't know this until we started doing research, but a few of these owners even moved their black mistresses and children to Ohio and set up households with them. And Greene County was a prime location for this. They would have a African American mistress by whom who gave birth to the children, the slave owners' children, and he would go and buy land for them, build a house for them, and put them in Ohio. And sometimes he would even divorce his wife and move to Ohio to live with them. So it's a very complex situation. Has anyone heard of Chihuahua Resort in Greene County? Well, you can see it's a really nice place. They had mineral springs there and things, and it went through a number of owners. And it was set up for white people from Cincinnati to come up and enjoy the benefits of these mineral springs. But it failed. And it went through, several different hands. And then one set of owners came up with the idea, well, why don't we use this for the Southern slaveholders to come up, for recreation. They can come up to Ohio and visit Chihuahua Resort and stay there, and they can bring their black mistresses with them and their children and have like a vacation in Ohio. Well, that went on too. In fact, the information on this is kind of sketchy. There's not a whole lot of solid evidence to this. There's just a lot of oral tradition. But there is so much that an opera has actually been written about this and has been performed. And guess what became a Chihuahua Resort? Whoops. Let's go back. It became Wilberforce College. Same ground, same building. You're looking at it from the back, the other illustration. This is the original building at Wilberforce College. And it was where Chihuahua Resort was originally located. Now, probably haven't had a speaker do this before. I'm going to discuss one critique of the book that appears in Amazon. And as I say, this is a problem with this book. This was it says decent book. I got 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you, Stray Cam. It says, author style is easy to follow and read, and they gave a decent overview. Here's the cons, which I put in a red block here. Cons for me as a student and amateur historian of African American history in Northwest Ohio is the fact that this book seems to center its focus on the white founders of these settlements and also on the emancipation of enslaved persons by whites. Of course, this should be included in the book where these sorts of situations occurred, but I felt that the focus on almost every chapter was on the white people and not the black residents of these settlements or their activities. There were some chapters that were better than others. This is essentially the problem that you're faced whenever you're doing a history of any marginalized group. And that's the lack of documentation. And the reason for that is they were treated as property. And so the records that exist are property records. Also, they tended to be illiterate. Maybe 10% of the enslaved people at the most were literate because they were denied education in many states. I mean, it was against the law to educate a slave. So they weren't generating these documents themselves. And the documents that were being generated all pertain to ownership, and taxes and that kind of thing. So when you're doing a history, the kind of documents you like to find are legal documents, correspondence, business correspondence, personal letters, diaries, journals, memoirs, interviews, newspaper articles, photographs, biographies. Those are really scarce when you're looking at a subject like this. There's some that are out there. What I am urging every time I go out and talk about this is if you know of any in your family, get them out there so historians can see them. It could be you have them in the closet, letters that were handed down through the family or photographs. As I said, most of these communities don't exist anymore. There's nothing out there. They're beyond being a ghost town. But it'd be great if these sources are out there to get them out where people can see them and use in compiling these histories. The obstacles are first of all, these communities I'm talking about, they were unnamed mostly, almost entirely were unnamed communities. The residents didn't call them by these names. The names were either called by others or kind of an afterthought. Most of them were unmapped, so you didn't even know there was a community there. They were unincorporated, with few exceptions, unidentified in any way. Research has been done has been looking at property records and then determining through the census who owned them and whether they were African American or not, and then trying to see if there's any connection between those people. They were in remote locations by design because they didn't want to be bothered with other people, especially white people. You know, they usually had bad experiences with white people. That's why they were here. And then they're real ephemeral. You know, they weren't building brick and stone homes. You know, they were putting together whatever they could put together, and it was just for a short period of time in almost all instances. So this is an illustration of what the problem is. You've all seen this vase. It's called a Reuben vase. And the thing about a Reuben's vase is you're focused on the white part of it. And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of the history is. You're focused on the white part. You only see these profiles of these people by looking at the negative space, the space around the object. And so you do a lot of inference from what has been written and what has been documented to piece together a history of the negative space. So that's the challenge. In the book, these are the 88 counties in Ohio. I've highlighted in yellow, it doesn't look yellow now, but highlighted in yellow, the black settlements prior to the Civil War that we discuss in the book. And you don't see any up in Erie County. That doesn't mean there wasn't any, just means that I was unable to find sufficient documentation to even write a few paragraphs. And here's a list. Everything in red here is what I'm going to be discussing during this time that we're together. And when you're writing a book and then you're presenting the book, you have to kind of rethink how you're going to present it. And in this case, what I've decided to do is focus on two of the major slave owners to show what happened to the people who were freed, emancipated in their wills. And then I'll talk about one particular family. So we're going to talk about two very wealthy slave owners, John Randolph, usually John Randolph of Roanoke, because there was another John Randolph, and also Samuel Gist. These guys, interestingly enough, both were really wealthy, but they followed entirely different paths. First one, John Randolph of Roanoke, inherited his wealth. It's the best way. But he was a congressman from Virginia. He was co-founder of the American Colonization Society in 1816, which means his solution to the slavery problem was to round up all the black people and send them back to Africa. So that meant really he didn't care for slavery that much, even though he was a tremendous slave owner, which you'll see is a conflict that a lot of them felt. He was opposed to slavery in theory, but depended on it to farm his 8,000 acres. Never married, suffered from tuberculosis. He was an opium addict, and he was an extremely bitter man. Also, this is when he was older, and he has kind of a youthful appearance, kind of a boyish face. They think he suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, which stunts your maturity. So he probably never went through puberty, which may explain a lot of his anger. But anyhow, he was a very powerful individual. in as far as his social realm was concerned. He strutted around the House of Representatives with a whip in his hand. He said he was supposed to be a passionate Christian who engaged in a duel with Henry Clay and was subject to fits of madness. The duel with Henry Clay is because he insulted Clay in Congress, and Clay demanded his satisfaction. So they went out with their seconds and their pistols and held this duel. And Clay fired first and shot him through the coat, but didn't injure him. John Randolph just took the gun and fired it into the air. He had no intention of killing Henry Clay. And it was just all so they could, this is what was expected of them at the time. Couldn't allow that insult to go unaddressed. So they just, Clay was obviously more angry than John Randolph was, but he didn't take the opportunity to shoot him. He wasn't, a vicious person in that respect anyway. As I say, he's possibly the most politically powerful man in the United States because of his role in Congress and his extreme wealth. His motto was, do what you feel. And I suppose that was in Latin, but I don't know. He left 3 wills, freeing his slaves and setting aside funds to help them resettle in a free state. So like a lot of these guys who were slave owners and didn't feel slavery was right, he waited until he was dead to free his slaves because they didn't want to give up. There were some nice things about being a slave owner. You had people do all the kinds of work you didn't want to do. And he wouldn't have had all the money and prestige and thing without these slaves that he had at his disposal. So in his will, he said, I give and bequeath to all my slaves their freedom, heartily regretting that I have ever been the owner of one. And he provided designated money to purchase land in Ohio for the slaves. And in 1846, which was about, 10, 15 years after he died, because always these wills were contested. And so you had lawyers fighting over them for a decade or more, and sometimes much more, trying to get as much money out of it for other people. But by 1846, you had 383 of his former slaves, he may have had 1,000 at one time, arrived in Cincinnati and headed up the Miami and Erie Canal. The land had been purchased for them at Carthagena, Mercer County, Ohio, by his executor. And Carthagena is the community my mother used to talk about. Here's how Carthagena came about, which is a story in itself. In 1829, Cincinnati had a huge riot. It wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last by far. I think they claim like 15 or 19 riots over their history. But in 1829, the African Americans who lived in Cincinnati, and it was a very desirable place for a Black person who was free to live because there was work. You could work on the river, you could unload boats, you could actually work on the boats, but they had jobs they could actually get. So it attracted a large community and of about 4,000 people. But the Irish who had arrived were also at the lower rung of the social order, just one rung above African Americans. And so they felt that the Black people were taking all their jobs. So this created resentment between the Irish and the African Americans. And they had a all-out fight. People were injured. And as a result of this, of the 4,000 African Americans living in Cincinnati, 1,200 of them left. Living in Cincinnati at that time was Augustus Waddles, who was a Quaker educator from Connecticut. He had worked among the African Americans, and in his estimation, they were totally ignorant of everything calculated to make good citizens. Again, that's because they weren't educated. There are very few of them had any proper schooling of any kind. And he felt that the only way you could change that was to get them out of that environment. And so he believed that the ideal thing would be to take them and move them to farmland and let them own their own farms, and then develop the skills to support themselves that way. That message appealed to some of them. And eventually he moved 15 families to Mercer County, but only on the condition they got him to agree that he would go with them and start a school. And so he did. So on his own, with his own money, he purchased all this land and set up these 15 families with farmland and erected a school. He had to go around and raise funds for that, but erected this school he called it Emlyn Institute. And it was essentially a trade school. But it wasn't just for them. He opened it to everybody. White students could go there. Native American students could go there as well, as long as the blacks, because he was a very big-hearted individual. I think is the way to say it. He just was open to all races, and he wanted the best for them. And so he started the school, and he taught trades primarily, all different kinds of trades. Carthagena turned out to be the largest African-American settlement in the country with 600 families. And that's because when they heard about this, the African-Americans throughout the country, they started gravitating there because they liked this idea of having their own community. And Charles Moore, who was the son of a woman who bought a lot of land there, he took it and platted Carthagena. And that's the first town ever platted by an African-American in Ohio. And he drew up this plat and registered it with the Mercer County courthouse. Interesting thing is, though, one of the descendants said it was actually his mother that drew it up. But here's the problem. You are formerly enslaved. You didn't really have much choice of what job you did. If you're in the South, and as I said, you're particularly dark, you're probably in the field, and you may have been growing cotton or tobacco. Nobody asked you if that's what you wanted to do with your life. And so many of these refugees who came to Mercer County, even though it was wonderful farmland, didn't want to be farmers. That's not, if given their druthers, now that you're free, they wanted to pursue what they wanted to pursue. And so a lot of the farms didn't thrive because just of lack of interest in being farmers. So since they owned the land themselves, they were free to purchase or to sell it. They sold it to the German farmers who were moving into the area because most of them wanted to go to the big cities. They'd probably heard of Chicago and places like that. That's where they wanted to go. It was more exciting than out in the middle of nowhere. So the farms, were sold off over time to the German farmers. And so when you get into the early part of the 20th century, there were very few African Americans living in that area at all. And I think the last one was buried there in like 1957. So here's what Carthagena looks like today. You have these homes there. And I want to point out this one that's in the forefront here. That was the former home of the black school teacher and postmaster in Carthagena. So we know that from property records. You'll notice it looks a lot like the house right next to it. This was a characteristic style of houses that they had in the black communities in northwestern Ohio. And we'll get to that in a minute. But here is the cemetery, some of the monuments that are still standing. It's next to St. Aloysius Cemetery, which is a Roman Catholic cemetery. They're divided by an iron fence that separates them. And as my daughter said when we were up there, it would have been really nice of them to take the fence down now that we're in the 21st century, because someone has to maintain it. And it'd be nice if it was just all one cemetery, especially since the monuments over here continue to fall over and disappear. Mary Ann Brown was an architectural historian, and she looked at this whole area of northwestern Ohio where a lot of the communities were. And this is the picture she uses in her paper on this type of architecture that was ubiquitous to these communities. This is near one of the communities, and you can see, if you look at the windows on the front there's two little square windows. That was pretty characteristic. This one over here has got two doors. You can see where lots of them had two doors, but they covered up one also. And it's not unusual for them to start changing the windows. They're getting prefab windows and putting them in to replace the old windows that are rotting out. So if you keep your eyes open, though, when you're up there, you can see these homes. Now, remember when we left the Randolph Slaves, they were on their way up the Miami-Erie Canal from Cincinnati, coming to Carthagena. Well, they reached a little town called New Bremen, which was in Mercer County at that time. It's now in Auglaize County. And there's several canal boats full of the 350 odd slaves who were coming up. And they reached New Bremen, and they were going to disembark there and walk to Carthagena. However, they were met by armed farmers who insisted that they weren't going to get off. Now, this is one of my mother's stories, which I was able to validate, because she's from New Bremen, was from New Bremen, she's deceased. But she said, I always heard that they weren't from New Bremen, people that wouldn't let them off the boat. And as it turns out, the names that we know of the people who were in the crowd, they're from St. Mary's, which was another German community, but it was farther away. And it was led by a judge named Lindsay there who was organized these people to stop them from disembarking. And so I was pleased to see that part was true, but I also have an account that I discovered in a slave narrative of people who came to New Bremen on the canal and talked about how helpful the people in New Bremen were of getting them a wagon, loading it up for them so they could continue on to Carthagena. So anyhow, at this particular instance, the Randolph slaves were forced to turn back and go back down the canal. They couldn't go on to Carthagena, where land had been purchased for them. So they went back as far as Piqua, Ohio, which is in Miami County, Ohio. And that's where they got off. And for the better part of a year, they lived in the park in the center of town. And what they were fortunate in that, in the vicinity of Piqua, there were a number of Quaker communities. And the Quakers, originally were slave owners, but early on in their history, they decided that was wrong. And after that, they became kind of the earliest abolitionists trying to eliminate slavery. So they organized themselves, it was the Friends of the Randolph Slaves, and they started going in and offering them jobs to come and work on farms. So a lot of them went off to work with these, Quaker families. Those who didn't ended up going to areas like Rossville, which is right across the Miami River from Piqua. It's just a short bridge. And they settled in Rossville. And then some went to Marshalltown and Hanktown, which are other small communities in Miami County. Nothing exists of Marshalltown or of Hanktown anymore. There's a little bit of Marshalltown left. Rossville, there's not much of anything, but there are some things that are important to the history of the Randolph slaves. Interestingly, two of the Randolph slaves, York Reel and Joe Moten, sued in 1904 to recover the 3,200 acres in Mercer County that had been purchased for the Randolph slaves. And the newspapers really followed this, but it went, all the way through the court. And in the end, the judge ruled that the statute of limitations was up. So they didn't recover anything, even though it had been purchased for them. And you're going to find there was a lot of what do we say? I don't know, just a lot of sneaky stuff going on with the land that was purchased for them, and various kinds, but that was one example of it. Rossville in 1913 got flooded. That's the Great Flood. It flooded everywhere. See, it didn't have any of its own businesses, so the African Americans, such as Alfred McKnight's son, he worked in Piqua, but they opened their own school in 1873. But almost from the first, again, Piqua is a small town. They wanted big towns, and so a lot of them just left and went elsewhere. And they're always looking for a better opportunity. This is what Rossville looks like today. You've got an African American cemetery, right, that has a few headstones in it, and they maintain it things. But here, this is the former home of York Reel, and one of his descendants, a woman named Helen Gilmore, owned it for many, many years and operated a museum out of it, Underground Railroad Museum. Unfortunately, she died back in the 80s or 90s. And since then, it's just stood empty. Her son owns it. And I tell people, if I had money, I'd buy that and preserve it because it's significant. It's the only surviving home from the Randolph Slaves era. And that's what she would have hoped for. She collected a lot of information, most of which went to Wilberforce University. But there's an opportunity for somebody. And here's Marshalltown and Hanktown. Hanktown, you just have a cemetery, and not much of a cemetery at that. It has 4 markers for Civil War veterans who are African Americans, and they were members of the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, which was the first unit that was formed after it was Lincoln made it legal for African Americans to join the military. And a lot of Ohioans then, blacks from Ohio, went to and joined the Massachusetts 55th and the Massachusetts 54th, then some other units. But neither place is there anything really to indicate anything other than cemeteries. Another place they went was Rumley in Shelby County, which isn't very far from New Bremen either. And it was purchased by a white man, Colonel Amos Evans, and he mapped it out. There's the community. But he sold the first lot to George Goines and the second one to Joel Goines, his brother. And they were members of the Wapoo tribe, Casabo Nation in South Carolina. So they were African Americans who had intermarried with Native Americans. And they came from the Lett Settlement in Muskingum and Guernsey counties. And the Lett is a fairly prominent name and easy to track. So I'm going to discuss that a little bit later if you want to see how they moved around. Because what happened with these communities, if you went there with your family group and settled, if you're a young male and you wanted to get married, you're not going to marry your sister or your cousin. So they would go off and move to these other communities where they were less likely to have a blood relative. And so that's why you can trace the Letts to all these different communities. This is what Rumley looks like now. See the house that's there? It's not indicated that it's a house from the community, but it sure looks like it. When the Goines brothers lived there, they built a hotel, a livery stable, were partners in a grist mill and a sawmill. Some of these, former slaves were very enterprising people, and it's remarkable what they accomplished. So at one time, the African American population in Rumley was 400, which was pretty sizable for that community. It was connected by family ties to Carthagena, Wren, and Middle Creek. But the clash between pro and anti-slavery factions drove many of the black citizens away during the Civil War. And the situation with Ohio was that, especially in the South, you had a lot of former Southerners and Southern sympathizers that settled there. And so you got to think of it as kind of three different pools. You had the people who were adamantly anti-slavery. Then you had those that were pro-slavery, and you had all these undecideds in the middle. And the key to our winning the Civil War was getting the undecideds to change their opinion. Rumley today, there's a church and there's this school building. They date from a later period. It's after the Civil War. Those are Civil War buildings. But they're there. The church is right across the street from the house I just showed you the picture of. And funny story. People, when I went to take a picture of the school, there was a deputy sheriff that's parked in front of it in his car, taking a break, I guess. So I get out my camera and I'm walking around. And I go over to tell him what I'm doing. He said, suppose you'd like me to move so I can get a picture of the building. I said, that'd be nice. Yeah, I said, what are you doing? I said, well, there used to be a very large African-American community here. And I'm telling him about it. And he looks at me and said, I've lived here my whole life. I've never heard that. Well, right next to the church, there's a historical marker that spells this all out. And this is a stone's throw away from the school. So, but and we had other experiences where people didn't realize what had been there, what was underfoot. East Rand was another community, east of Rand actually, was another community where the Randolph Slaves settled. It likely formed because Augustus Waddell, who formed Carthagena, had spoken there, trying to get people interested in that. And Godfrey Brown was a remarkable individual who was a former slave. He worked. He was a skilled. Had his skill. I think he was a shoemaker, I believe. But he earned enough money to buy his own freedom. Then bought his wife's freedom. Then bought his kids' freedom. Then he bought some freedom of his relatives. And he also bought a huge piece of land in Ohio. Moved everybody to Ohio. Started a community in Brown County or Greene County, Brown Settlement. And then he started looking for other places. So he would go out and buy land in these other communities that were forming too. So they bought land in east of Wren. And it was called east of Wren because Wren was the city and the African-American population was to the east of it. And Wren is just 25 miles from Carthagena. So these are all in fairly close proximity. And here's just a sketch. There's Wren, there's Glenmore, which is another community. And all those names you see were African-American in between at one point in time. East of Wren today, there's a suspicious looking house out in the woods near this cemetery. The cemetery is all that survives. It's a black cemetery. It was shared by two black churches. Neither of the churches is there. And I was glad that the ground was frozen that day. I went, in the middle of winter like now, and it was frozen because it would have been a mud hole otherwise, because it's out in the middle of a farmer's field. So I just drove off the highway and drove back in the mud. And there's a few headstones there, but that's it. And I talked to somebody in Wren about this. Who's owned a restaurant, had no idea there was anything like that ever. And then some of the Randolph slaves ended up in Sydney, Ohio, which was an entirely different experience because they were just, a small group in a fairly substantial town. And so it was kind of ghettoized. They were in a neighborhood that was called Fancy Bird, which was kind of a pejorative term because it was anything but fancy. And by 1900s, resentment began to build against them because they had such large families. And this happens to be a postcard that was taken in the early 1900s, and the caption says, "No race suicide in Sydney, Ohio." Well, what that refers to is there was concerns in the early 1900s that white people weren't having too many children and black people were having a lot of children. So they're going to overwhelm us. And so they would actually send out there's variations of this theme on postcards from that era. This is the only one I've seen with actual photograph. And you can't even say for sure that's the same family. They may have just lined up a whole bunch of, we're going to take your picture. But usually it's a cartoon of some kind, very derogatory cartoon. So here's where the former Randolph slaves settled, is in that blue area, those areas. But they're very hard to track because none of them seem to have taken the Randolph surname. And you don't know what last names they did use. That's what makes it difficult to identify them. The Gist slaves, Samuel Gist. He was born in Bristol, England. He was orphaned as a boy, came to America as an indentured servant to John Smith. And he was 21 or 22 when he came to the United States. He learned John Smith's business, did John Smith's business for him. When John Smith died, he married John Smith's widow and inherited Smith's estate. Like John Randolph, he was mega wealthy. Lots and lots and lots of money. Since he was from Britain, he was opposed to the American Revolution. So he transferred all of his holdings to his stepdaughter, who remained in the United States, and went back to England. Then later he decided to reclaim the property, and they had a legal squabble so he could get it back. But he also decided to free his slaves following his death. And he set aside $4 million to use in resettling his slaves. And he wanted them to be able to build houses for them, buy land, build houses, establish churches and schools. So, he could be generous after he was dead. However, he didn't use a Virginia lawyer, a lawyer from the United States, when he wrote his will. So it was easily taken apart in the courts in the United States by those who wanted the money. So he created this legal quagmire. And again, it took, a decade or so for people to be freed after this. And what that means, when you're talking about a group of people that large, some of them are going to die, but others are going to be born. And so the group overall just keeps getting larger and larger. So he had more slaves were freed than actually had at the time he died. 350 of them came to Ohio on foot. A large number remained in Virginia because they thought that they could live on his property. However, once you're freed, you're kind of you are it's kind of open season on you. You can be recaptured or re-enslaved by anybody. So that's why the law usually required you to take people out of slave states, put them in a free state, because otherwise people just enslave them again. So anyhow, there's an article talking about them coming to Ohio, but they would walk all the way here. And there was land purchased for them in Adams and Erie counties, but little was known of either of those settlements. Okay. They seem to have vanished fairly quickly. And the Erie County settlers are known to have returned to Virginia, which a lot of them, when they got here, things were just so difficult. They decided, I'm going back to what I know. And you don't know what became of them after that, but that's what happened. And then some of them may have actually gone on to the other communities. In Brown County, Ohio, we had two camps, or two settlements, Upper Camp and Lower Camp. And they were both outside of Georgetown. Upper Camp was the closest one. And there were 150 settlers, and he bought them almost 1,200 acres of land. However, it was awful land. It was, it had undergrowth, stagnant water, thistles and things. They said it was barely good for, grazing if you had a buffalo, but it was just unfarmable. So these people were extremely impoverished. And this is one of the few settlements you'll read anything about people actually begging because they had no way of supporting themselves. And then the slave catchers would come up here to raid them, and carry off whomever they could take, because depending upon when they came, what period, it was pretty much you could grab anybody off the street and claim they were a slave, and they'd have to prove that they weren't. Wilber Camp, pretty much the same situation. Very poor soil for farming and things. So both of these camps didn't last very long, these settlements. And they just were shacks, houses made out of sticks. The one that did last for a while was the Gist Settlement in Highland County, Ohio. See, it shows up on the map at one time as dark. They wouldn't have called themselves that. But you'll see this on these, maps in the 19th century. They'll have used racial pejoratives and things to identify the areas. This is the largest and longest lived. However, and this happened to a lot of the settlements, the agent who goes to buy the land for the slaves, former slaves, keeps the title in his name. So they never owned it. And in the case of the Gist Settlement in Highland County, because they never owned it, they didn't pay taxes on it either. Well, eventually the sheriff catches up with them because you've got all these taxes that are owed on the property. And they didn't have the money, and they didn't even have the title. So he sells it, sells the land out from under him for delinquent taxes. Well, down there, you've still got two descendants of the Gist slaves who went about buying the land back. And there's two of them. One owns almost all of it. The other one owns just a small part, but they don't get along. They're fighting all the time. And here, if you look at the purple or magenta or whatever it was at the time I did it, that's where the Gist slaves generally settled. Now, I was going to mention the Lett family because this is a family that's kind of easy to track. And what I want to refer you to is there's a website called oldsettlersreunion.com. And if anybody has any family that may have been in these settlements, this is the kind of thing I would like to see for all of them. Because this is a group of descendants of a particular group settlement in Ohio that went to Michigan. And they had annual reunions, and they still have them. And they have a website, and they share their family histories, they share their photographs. And so there's a wealth of information there. But that's unique. Most of them don't have anything like that. But I spoke in Zanesville a week ago, and one of the people there was a member of the Old Settlers Reunion. So they even publish their own histories. So there was a Lett Settlement in Muskingum County, near Zanesville, and Samuel Delaney Lett married Jemima Banneker in Maryland. Their children migrated to Guernsey, Muskingum, Morgan, and Belmont counties in Ohio. Aquila Lett married Christina Cobbler, a German woman who may have had some Native American ancestry. And the Letts were instrumental in advancing the civil rights of the Black community, including the right to a public education and to vote. Those are issues that they tackled in Zanesville, Ohio, and won on. So, and it was Aquila Lett was kind of the prime mover in that. Paynes Crossing, Hocking, and Perry counties, it was settled by free blacks and fugitives from slavery who came from Virginia during the 1830s. The family names were Harper, Betts, Mabry, Scriblins, Hardin, Hans, Payne, and Lett. And I mentioned many moved to Michigan. They moved to Michigan because the land was now, they opened it for homesteading. The land was much cheaper than it was in Ohio. So they went up there, again, seeking greater opportunity. What I want to mention is if you go to our website, explodingstove.com, we couldn't put all the genealogical information in our book that we gathered. So if you go there and look at a tab that says extras, then scroll down on it, you'll find genealogical information for almost all the settlements we discussed. So you can see what the family names were. Okay. But the Paynes Crossing people, there's nothing there except the cemetery now. It's been absorbed by Wayne National Forest, but the memory of it's kept alive in Michigan, where these people are still living. And that's the old settlers reunion. And these are, it tells you about the counties in Michigan where these people settled. And they were the ones that came up from Champaign County were called the Little Riverlets. And I don't know why. Hicks Settlement is where some of the slaves or the Lett slaves settled as well. This was in Ross County, named for Tobias Hicks, a former slave from Maryland. U.S. Representative John Mercer Langston, who's a really important figure in civil rights, usually associated with Oberlin, Ohio, where he's a professor, but he founded the Howard University Law School. He was just a teenager, I think 15 or 16, when they hired him to be the school teacher in the Hicks settlement. Then there's PP settlement in Pike and Ross counties. That was a guy's initials, Peter Patrick. He had carved him into a tree down there. But again, some of the Letts settled in there. They had a lot of conflict with two white families down there, which we cover in the book, the Burkes and the Downings. And they weren't passive. They didn't put up with it. Here's an interesting thing. This is a Lett cabin, original Lett cabin that was built in 1850 or so in Defiance, Ohio. And I wrote a book on jazz in Ohio and did a presentation there because they have a jazz festival every year, Defiance, Ohio. And they told me, even though they're very proud of some Black jazz musicians from Defiance, they said historically we weren't very friendly to Black people. Well, apparently they didn't want this house either, this cabin, because Williams County took it and put it on their fairgrounds. So if you want to see the Lett family home from Defiance, got to go to Williams County, which is next door. Then another community, which is really interesting, is outside of Waverly, Ohio. And Waverly's in Pike County. It was a sundown town. Sundown town is one where African Americans are told they had to be out of town by sundown. They couldn't remain there overnight. Well, just east or west was where the east is where the Black people lived. And they called it East Jackson or Cars Run or Straight Creek. And the interesting thing about that is here's a picture of some of them, and they're blonde and blue-eyed. They still identify as Black because they have African Americans in their ancestry. And they're kind of a marginalized group because of being a sundown town. So they still, they don't, again, and they're also Catawba Indians, but they still see themselves as Black because the community saw them as Black for so long. And this is where the Lett family settled, and in the green area that I've indicated there. And this is from the Old Settlers Reunion. This is one of the pages just showing all the ancestor or the descendants of those groups. Here's what my website looks like, Exploding Stone Media. That shows where the tab is. It says extra. There's one of the tombstones from the cemetery in Rossville showing how it's embedded in a tree. That's it. Questions? Yes.
I want to know what kind of difference in your mother. I mean,
my mother was just always a curious person. She's always interested in everything. Her, yeah, her father was a teacher. However, his subject was German. When World War I came about, he was forbidden to teach German. They were forbidden to speak German. And so he became a postman after that. But so they went through their own kind of discrimination as well as a result of World War I. But no, she's just always been interested in that kind of stuff. And she was very interested in history, so she would always point it out. And I just.
But interestingly, the history she told me to share with you and expose you to, yeah, she kind of looked like this. Into it.
Yeah. Well, my
my biggest thing, kids know that you don't have to become an adult to be a teacher. I think you share what you know with someone else in such a way that they'll become curious about everyone. That's what we typically happen because
yeah.
that just really is the natural premise for people pursuing their own learning because it doesn't figure it out.
Yeah, I became interested in history despite school. Yeah, yeah, because you know what is taught is kind of this contained stuff. There's certain milestones that you're supposed to learn, certain age you're supposed to learn, and all the really interesting stories fall outside of that. And so I'm a footnote person. I always look in the footnotes to see what wasn't important enough to put in the main body, and that's where my history lies, or the stuff I'm interested in. But as I mentioned, my daughter is my co-author on much of this, and her interest is as great as mine, if not more so. And we've now taken her 5-year-old son along when we do some of our research, and he loves old buildings, you know, and he's a smart kid. But so I'm hoping that he'll carry on the same interest that I have. Maybe she and he can write some books together. But yeah, that's what it was. I mean, it goes back to my parents. The issue of the American history. Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff was just flat out wrong. But I think everything, and I've emphasized this too. If you go back and start reading newspaper microfilms from the 19th century, every newspaper made you aware of its politics right in its masthead. You know, it was the something Democrat, the something Republican, the something Free Soiler. And every story was tainted by that. So you have situations which you have to resolve, like, well, when I was writing the book on, lynchings and mob violence in Ohio, there was in Marion, Ohio, either 1,500 men in white robes on horses rode through town, or they didn't. And it depends on which newspaper you read. And that's all you have to go by. You know, and so it's kind of like, you're not seeing this. And I mean, we're seeing this on the news today. If you watch cable, this occurred. No, it didn't. You know, you're not seeing this. It didn't occur. Well, I'm watching it. No, that didn't happen. It's different than the way you think you're seeing it. So that still goes on. And I don't know how you get the politics out of it anymore. But that's what keeps me digging. I try to find as many references as I can to substantiate, because there's been some best-selling history books that have some major errors in them. And they've relied entirely upon newspaper accounts. Like there was a incident in one book, I won't call her out, but my daughter likes to point this out. We have found that there are a lot of April Fool's stories that are published in newspapers that end up being regarded as true history. And what they did, if you just take that account, and it may have been reported in more than one newspaper, but if I heard that, okay, there was this massacre that took place, who was killed? Well, I try to get names to go with. Okay, what evidence do I have that they died, at that time? And I'm finding, no, they didn't. They lived beyond that time. So they weren't killed in that incident. And you just have to rely upon your own knack for ferreting out the truth to find out what exactly happened. And people, here's what I hate, not being an academic. I don't rely upon what somebody else wrote. And it does, I don't reference all the literature on it because I don't know that it's true, because I have found errors in that stuff. And so you have to, and you hope you don't to make it worse. That we try to substantiate things as best we can. But that's why I encourage people to bring information out. I get a lot of it, not a lot, but I get some information from a friend of mine who is an avid collector, and there's nothing that he isn't interested in. And he has come up with things I never would have expected. Like I've got a picture of a death mask in there that was made of a slave child. And the story that goes about how he tracked that down and got it goes along with, there's a Tiffany style lamp that he got at the same time from the same person. Look at it closely, it's all stained glass, has these little glass pendants hanging around. Take a good close look at this pendants. It's of people being hanged. So somebody went to the trouble of making this beautiful Tiffany style lamp, but it was for a Southern slave owner. And he was able to talk the person into giving it to him for his collection. But he got the death mask kind of the same way. But he's just been remarkable. Well, I'll tell you, James Earl Ray, Martin Luther King's assassin, he heard that James Earl Ray's home was being torn down. So he drove there, just got in the car, drove. I think his childhood home was like Illinois or someplace. Just drove through the night, got there, and found, it was semi-collapsed. They started tearing it down. And he went in looking for anything that it might have belonged to James Earl Ray. He goes walking around, finds out that the bathroom has fallen into the basement because of the way the house was being collapsed. He works his way through it, gets to the medicine cabinet, opens it up, finds a tin cup, an enamel tin cup with James Earl written on it, on the cup. And that's what he brings back as so he'll go anywhere and do anything to add stuff to his collection. He's got all kinds of obscure things, but it's knowing people like that. But there's things out there. I had an African American secretary who's in her 90s now, but when I go to her house, I'm just struck by the fact she's from Beckley, West Virginia. And on the wall, going up the stairway, she's got a picture of her father, and her grandfather, and her great grandfather. And her father is very dark, as is she. The grandfather is a little lighter. Great grandfather is perfectly white. And I hope someday to write a book where I can actually use that. I'd like to put those three photos right together just to show the lineage. of my secretary. Because it was just, it's just so striking. And you can see the features. You can see the features. You see, yes, this is the same family. Yeah. I mean, my whole goal is to make people understand, able to discuss these things in a rational manner. Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to read the 16 million?
I've read much of it.
Some of it's kind of.
Yeah, and some of them I have some quibbles with.
Well, it's still good. Every now and then.
I can relate.
Every now and then you have. But those portions.
Yeah, I think, the more we know, the more we know. And that's the thing. There's, yeah. Right. Yeah. And, I think, again, going back to the criticism of this book, white sources were used for a lot of this. But a lot of these communities ended up being formed by slave owners who decided to get rid of their slaves, free them, and actually arrange for them to come here. And in one case, which we recount in the book, a woman took it upon herself to try to bring them to Ohio during the Civil War. And she's leading this group on her own. And she ends up having to hand them off to a Union officer who swore that he would ensure that they arrived in Ohio.
How do people go down to that?
Yeah.
Were they still trying to buy it off? And benefiting from that institution. This may not be good in the end for me, so.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that in it. But I think also, there's people, if they got rid of their slaves, they wouldn't be able to run their plantations. If they couldn't run their plantations, then they couldn't live the way they wanted to live. So even though I know this is bad, kind of good for me, And I think that it was kind of an approach of whiteness thing. I mean, that was clearly with Thomas Jefferson. I mean, he liked being surrounded by all that stuff that comes with being money. He liked being in a powerful position like that. He liked being able to pick up and go to Paris if he wanted to. He couldn't have done that if he had tried to hire people to work his plantation, because there wasn't enough manpower to do that. That's the thing. There wasn't enough people to go out and hire to run your plantations. Slavery was the only way they could think of making it work. And it was like, okay, I need a lot of people. And when you're settling Ohio, you see this a lot. That, give you an example. Thomas Worthington, father of Ohio statehood, came from Virginia. He was a slave owner. He comes here and frees the slaves, but he also builds cabins on his plantation here in Ohio that looks just like the slave quarters that he had back in Virginia. He's got the same people, only now they're indentured servants. He promised them that they would all get land. They didn't. So they came here ostensibly because they were opposed to slavery. It's awful hard to give it up. There's, and if you read, like Mary Chestnut, who kept those diaries and things. I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's awful. Slavery is awful. But I don't really like to clean up after myself. So who do we get to do that? It's very. self-indulgent people to this extent that it, they had to come up with all this twisted logic to justify what they were doing. And I get annoyed by people now who say, well, I never would have done that. I say, I wish, I hope I would never have done that. But the society was such that there are powerful forces, keeping things in place. At one time, in Virginia, you couldn't legally free a slave. The Virginia government prohibited it. So it's a complex subject. And in the next book that just came out, Reverse Underground Railroad in Ohio, what we do is we go through and talk about how the law changed and how that changed how people felt about fugitive slaves. And what happened is, we talked about the three groups, the anti-slave, pro-slave, undecided. What moved the undecided into the anti-slavery group is two things. One, the law changed in 1850, fugitive slave law, that basically compelled you to assist in capturing fugitive slaves. Well, before that, okay, that's not my business. I don't have to get involved in that. Well, now you did. They could force you to get involved if fugitive slaves running out there. You don't want you're part of the posse going after them. The other thing was they were going around and picking people off the street and accusing them of being fugitive slaves. Well, some of these people, especially the children, are very, 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 very light skinned. And so once this fear went through, hey, they could grab anybody. And it's not just a black person issue now. It's anybody that, they just choose. And it's a lot of people, laid down their lives in order for us to finally overturn slavery. And I like to see all those people get the recognition that they deserve, because there was a real tug of war going on within the country. Fortunately, we came out on the right side of it. Yes.
And you're talking about physical evidence of certain things.
Yeah.
Things that they think are going to be destroyed as their proof. That it's whatever purpose they've been holding on.
Everybody that collects anything, and I'm a collector, has this fear that they'll end up in the wrong hands. And by the wrong hands, I really mean people who don't appreciate it. No, but that wouldn't stop you from making copies of it. If it's a letter or something, and sharing them with a library. You've got that what's it called, Ohio Memory Project thing. A real helpful thing if you're doing Underground Railroad is the fact that everything that the professor at Ohio State, his name's Siebert, everything that he did, his notes when he was writing his histories, the Underground Railroad, are online. So you can go through and read the original source materials and also his manuscripts, his corrected manuscripts. So it's good to have this stuff out there. And, I'm already concerned. What's going to happen to my stuff that I've collected, to ensure that it's properly respected and cared for.